Hello.
Okay, hello. I think we're good to go. If I'm not, just let me know. This panel is called Your Boss is a DAO, and we have a lot of great people here from the DAO space. We are not going to run this panel as a regular panel. We are going to run this panel as a DAO, so we won't have a formal moderator. We will just kind of flow with the questions as we all kind of come up with them. And I think ultimately we all have a lot of context from a lot of different DAOs here, so I'm super excited just to see what everyone's perspective is with some of these questions that we're all trying to think about now in the space. The first one that comes to mind for me, and I can kick it off, is like, what is the term DAO? Like, what are we talking about when we talk about DAOs? Because historically, we've said decentralized autonomous organizations. That itself is clearly, I don't think, what most people here would call a DAO. It's the same problem with NFTs. Non-fungible tokens are this sort of like nebulous term. So yeah, what do we mean by DAO? Like maybe to start, and in that process, maybe just try and do a quick intro of yourself and sort of the DAOs that you're part of. Kristen, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. And since you said there are no rules, I'm going to move my chair. Better see my other panelists here. So I'm Kristen Stone. I'm the COO at Balancer Labs, and I've had the privilege of working in crypto since 2014 when I was at Coinbase. I think a benefit of that was seeing an organization go from 10 people, well, 50 people, but I had friends who were there at 10, all the way up to 800. And that was just to watch that level of scale, to watch how quickly things change, to watch things go really from bottom up to top down, and see what that became has informed me a lot as I've moved to Balancer and just been involved with other groups in the space. And it's a good question. What does DAO mean? And I'll lean back on a podcast where Joel Monegro was on a Bankless podcast, and he shared, I think of these a lot more as digital organizations right now because they're not so autonomous. So when I experience a DAO, I experience all of us discovering what it means to have an organization, or as we're here today, a panel, without a leader who has granted authority from an institution. It is a leader who has authority from granted by a community, by a group, by the collective. And that's where my mind goes. Ooh, I can pass it over. Who to?
Yeah, I want to jump on the digital organizations now, right? I think that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is a DAO and define this thing, but I really think it's evolved into something so much greater. Like Scott brought up that NFTs is a non-fungible token, but we're seeing the NFT ecosystem grow way beyond this very small definition. So I think we've also seen the definition of a DAO change over time. I think that a few years ago, most of the DAOs we saw were protocol DAOs, and there was a big A piece to that, the autonomous piece, that there is this automated protocol, whereas today we're seeing DAOs like FWB, and there's not necessarily an automated protocol that we're organizing around. So we're seeing digital organizations, and that still fits within sort of the DAO description we see today. So I think we're sort of seeing this constant expansion and compression of what a DAO is. But I'm excited by the growth of that definition. I'm also Julia Rosenberg. I'm the co-founder of Orca Protocol, and we're working on building tools for DAO organizations.
I love that. I'll round it out here by saying that I owe my whole career to DAOs, working in the Ethereum ecosystem. It's been a blessing so far for me. I think that DAOs are really more of an ethos than anything else. I like to say that they're internet native LLCs, but I think more than anything, it's being able to work with your friends and sustain yourself off the work that you do. And so to keep it short, I work across 15 to 20 DAOs right now, trying to stand up internet communities. And they've been a really amazing way for me to work full-time in crypto, build really amazing things, and bring them to life.
I really like the phrasing of internet native communities. To me, the main thing that you're building is a community, and you just happen to have incentives that are tied to that. But ultimately, the goal of the DAO is just to create a culture and to create a kind of mission and a way to facilitate that. And so I think that's super powerful. For my part, I work at Gitcoin. Gitcoin has recently turned from an organization focused on public goods funding into a formal DAO, and we're ultimately focused on trying to figure out how do we actually solve these broad coordination problems that just historically haven't really been solved very well from the sort of institutional level. So, for example, actually there was a lot of Twitter conversation about this lately on climate change. Like, there's all these sort of like problems, climate change and open source software is what we've historically focused on, that we've tried to coordinate on a governmental level or on a sort of corporate level, and what that's resulted in is mostly just capture of the problem itself, or just complete kind of incompetence and lack of that problem being solved. And so I think increasingly what people are realizing is that you can solve these things through much more peer-to-peer systems, much more internet-native systems, and that's what we're sort of trying to do on a global scale, solve these coordination problems for public goods funding. The tragedy of the commons at the global scale happens because large institutions only care about things within their jurisdiction, whether that's a company or a country still applies, and so we have to think globally. I want to take a second to maybe just like highlight one thing in Cooper, your work, that I think is really powerful, which is the sort of idea that like DAO should be culture first, culture and values first. So you've obviously thought a lot about this in the FWB context. Like, what do you feel makes a strong DAO culture? How do you instantiate those values?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's about ownership and responsibility. I think there's a difference between giving someone a token that has governance rights and actually allowing them to do meaningful things with those tokens. So when people come into our community, we really try and facilitate different areas that they can contribute. We try and show them pockets and people that they would really align with. I think over time, as people make very personal relationships, they're much more willing to contribute in a deeper work sense, and that onboarding funnel is something that I care very deeply about. And I know, Kristen, we talked about this with teal organizations. I think that this is a fantastic example of this, and I would love for you to give an overview on what that is and how it applies to DAOs.
Sure. Let's see. There's a lot in there. I don't know if I can totally give a full overview of teal organizations. Are you familiar with teal organizations, Julie? Okay. So,
No.
Okay. So this comes from Frederick Laloux, who wrote a book called Reinventing Organizations, and it has the background of looking at how human consciousness has evolved over time and different philosophies, both how individuals evolve through their lifetime as well as how human consciousness has evolved over time, and then how organizations have evolved, and studying that. And so it's gone from a few examples like red organizations that are all about like a single dictator leader, and we still have some of these in terms of the mafia and gangs, more or less, is like the only examples that we still have today. So then evolutions evolved. We got orange evolutions that care about profit and power. So this is a lot of our common organizations that exist today. And Frederick posits that the next version of organizations will be teal organizations. And the metaphor here is a living system. So it is blossoming and blooming and changing, and it has a lot less, of course, hierarchy, but also a lot less structure in the same way that we know structure to be today. And this is where internet nativeness matters. This is where culture matters, values matter. And the richness of values, one thing that I have a really fascinating curiosity about is, will values just be a couple of values? So in an organization, you get like a mission and a vision and values. But in a community, who's making those values? And is it really just something that is emergent as the result of everybody contributing and participating? So what do you think? Where are values coming from in your ecosystems?
I'll add on to that quickly. I think that it's ever evolving. I think the values at the start of a DAO is very different from the values today. You see that the leaders and the core contributors are changing over time, and so I think you hold on to this one identity or spirit, and then over time that evolves into what it practically means. And so in the case of DAOs, the thing that I really take away from teal organizations is everyone be able to self-identify what they want to work on and how much they want to get paid for that work. I think it's very different fundamentally from a hire. We have a job listing that has a fixed salary. You come into a DAO, you think about the time you want to contribute, the areas you want to work on, and how you're getting paid for that. And I think over time what you start to see is that people feel much more active and engaged in those conversations. And so as far as values are concerned, I think this is why you're noticing that social clubs have the highest governance participation of any group in the world right now. You have thousands of individuals coming to vote on very small governance proposals because they feel empowered and an owner of that conversation. And so, around that, I think that values are something that are presented by the founders of a DAO. But I've personally learned that the most successful DAOs are the one where you really take a step back. You let other people decide for you. You're really meant to be a leader and a voice and an advocate for what other people think, but you're not meant to be a dictator in that conversation.
I think that brings up a really good point too, and like my sort of answer to the values question comes back to leadership. Like I think traditionally, like you said, we see values arise from like top-down structures. Like, okay, the leaders of the organization set the values of that organization, and everyone follows. But obviously, what we're building with DAOs, we're kind of revolutionizing how leadership can be structured in these organizations. So I sort of want to pose a question, like, do you guys think that, how do you see leadership surfacing in DAOs and the many ways that kind of comes to life?
I think structurally for us, it's been interesting because we've taken a sort of like hybrid approach in the sense that a lot of DAOs tend to be like formally structureless. There's no real like kind of executive authority. It's all sort of legislature, and you have the DAO making decisions in a lot of cases either by consensus, so like IETF style, like hand raising, like if there's objections, you raise and sort of like surface those, try and understand where they're coming from, or you do like last mile voting on like a very like high level. And I think what I've realized works really well is if you have like this combination of like what we call work streams, and work streams are just like functional units within a DAO that have the executive sort of authority to like do things that are relevant. And I think even the terms like legislature, executive authority, like these are probably a bit too formal for like what we're talking about here, but just to compare this to like sort of existing organizations, you can think of these as almost like kind of independent like boards of these like subgroups that are trying to organize around principles that ultimately go back to provide value to the rest of the DAO. I think it's still very challenging, even in that context, to always have a totally leaderless organization. And I think it gets easier over time if, like as Cooper mentioned, you're able to like very carefully articulate the values of what you're trying to do and the mission of what you're trying to do. And I think that's partly why it works so well in the context of a lot of social clubs, because a lot of people in those contexts understand what they want to see out of that organization, and they feel like by the fact that everyone is constantly in these like very social environments, they understand each other, understand where each other are coming from. You can do that through a mission-oriented approach as well, but I think that sort of just like aspect of making sure people feel like that togetherness is very important.
I think this brings up a really basic human need of belonging. And so a shared set of values makes you feel like, okay, I belong here. I'm with like kind, we all have a shared social agreement and commitment. And one of the hardest questions I wonder about is what happens if someone doesn't belong, or if someone doesn't feel like they belong. Probably the formal way to call this is conflict resolution, right? But how do you see conflict resolution evolving in DAOs?
I think onboarding and membership are the single most important aspect of any DAO. I think that a lot of times in crypto, we expect people to be able to find their own way, identify what they want to work on, go into different governance proposals and whatnot. But the reality is most people have no clue what they're doing. They get dropped into a Discord server, they see a million channels with a million notifications, and they feel really lonely. And I think to this, if someone's in the first place getting started, really focusing on that experience, hand-holding them into the right channel is a good starting point. But as you start to notice discomfort and contention within a community chat channel, taking the time to set aside 30 minutes of your week and have a conversation with this person, allowing them to be heard and really express where they're coming from. I think that this like intent to really communicate even with the newest members of the community and really make it feel like a family ethos is really special. That's why I actually think that smaller communities are doing a lot better than bigger ones now, because community members feel much more empowered to take ownership over those relationships and make sure that people are actually in the right spot.
I also think too that if you feel that you don't belong in that ecosystem, then like the DAO is the perfect place to kind of figure out that next step. Like DAOs are supposed to be these extremely fluid ecosystems. So if you feel like you need to drive the DAO in a different direction, it's basically on you to kind of find consensus and rally the community behind you and basically convince the community that this is the right direction to go in. And that's like one of the most powerful parts of the DAO, is that like if you disagree, you completely have the opportunity to affect change, which is not something that exists in legal, like centralized organizations.
Yeah, I felt this very deeply in my work with FWB. You know, early on, I think that people were not aware what governance is. I would propose something and generally would get accepted. It was a very fluid process. We see this across DeFi. But more recently, I've noticed that there's times when I'll present something and people have very different feedback on what that is. And so for leaders of a DAO, I think it's important to recognize that you don't always have the best answers in mind. You need to be really open to getting feedback from the community because they're the ones that are driving things. And if you push something through governance that's not supported by the community, it's a losing battle. You know, even if you think that it's a great idea as someone who's very influential in a community, if you push that through without the support of your smallest members, it's going to ruin the whole vibe and it's not even worth it in the first place.
Yeah, I think Kane brought up a great point of this today. Is like he very much recognizes his part that he plays in the synthetics ecosystem, and he brought up a great point of like that there's hard power in these DAO ecosystems of you voting and having this governance token and affecting that change in that way. But there's so much soft power that still exists in DAO ecosystems, and all of these social relationships are still extremely relevant.
It's one of the biggest problems you're seeing now in like a lot of those larger DAOs, right? Like the delegation of power needs to be kind of legitimized. Like you need to have the ability to delegate to people that you truly trust, that you truly believe in. Otherwise, you'll just have this system in which like the people who are actually voting don't feel like they understand their constituents, and the constituents don't feel like they understand the delegates, and that just creates like the dissonance that can break down a DAO over time. So like, I actually want to go back to your question and kind of like just add to it, which is like, and Cooper, you mentioned like DAO scaling is difficult. Like, how do you think about these social systems, these soft power systems, you know, consensus by humming style systems scaling?
I'll start off here, but I'd love to hear other opinions. I think for me, you know, Orca has this great term called pods, and I think it's very accurate. I think that breaking down DAOs into subsections of very specific working groups is really important. There are going to be people who are more skilled to do some tasks than others, and really giving identity and power to those who are really influencing the DAO in a meaningful way, I think is very, very important. So rather than trying to think of your DAO as a broad community of 1,000 members, splitting that down into different pockets of, let's call it 10 to 20 people, and each of those 10 to 20 people having a leader responsible with that work, I think it's a way to start seeing opinions in a much more consolidated format and make progress without having to worry about getting the opinions of 1,000 people at once, which realistically is just not going to happen.
There's so much hitting me here, and I've loved pods and this idea of working groups, because when you work together with somebody on something, and everyone I'm sure can think of a person who they got to work with and you built a stronger bond out of that, like even our connection here, right? Because we had to coordinate and come together, and there's work that goes into it that then connects you in a different way. And pods will give you that because you have a shared context. As opposed to just saying, oh, we all like this thing or we all value the same thing. It's like, no, we have a shared context and we're working towards a shared goal. And there's a depth in that. And I think it's a little bit different, interestingly, in the teal organizations, in reinventing organizations. Family organizations is the green one. And so Southwest does this and a couple other groups, but that's actually one evolution marker before teal. So the reason that family is a little bit different is that family is with you through all time. But at work, and I think in DAOs as well, it is appropriate to outgrow certain groups. And that should be allowed and appreciated, and you can weave through it, which I do feel is kind of missing in as DAO scale. We have this question, and what hit me over the head, I was talking with Zach from Coordinate, and he was like, we have this idea of weavers in organizations, and they actually like weave conversations between working groups. They're whole and like valid like areas of work that just help to connect other subgroups. And that's really hit me, because I think when DAOs grow, and even if you get pods, you still have this challenge of the pods communicating, and whose responsibility does that fall on? So it's been a big question.
100%. I think that our thinking with Orca, we sort of like to coin ourselves as like a people-first protocol. Like we sort of forget when we're building governance systems and all of these DAO frameworks that at the end of the day, what we're doing is organizing people that are excited around a certain thing. So our goal is really just to figure out how we can create a wrapper around this most basic primitive in DAOs, which is just people and human coordination. And I think we'll start to see really interesting mechanisms created of like how we click these working groups together, and sort of how that evolves naturally over time with the organization, rather than these very like organizations having to mold to these very prescriptive frameworks.
I think it's super interesting that none of us have brought up really a lot of like technologies. We've all brought up things that are facilitating people. Like we're not talking about like Discord. We're not talking about like Snapshot. We're talking about like what are the things that actually allow people to feel like that togetherness, feel like they're connected. And I think that like, so what I've learned so far is we've got teal organizations using pods connected by weavers. We've got like a few like things here, but they're all like conceptual. Like they're all like conceptual frameworks, like thinking like about like how we basically connect people. So I think that's super powerful. I guess like we never quite answered one question, which you brought up, which is like, how do you think about like when does someone not fit like the vibe of a DAO or like the culture of a DAO? How do you deal with like, in a company it's very easy because their formal structure is to say, hey, here are our HR processes, here's why this didn't work or did work. How do we do that like right now in DAOs? Like what is the sort of best practice, and how are you thinking about that in your own DAOs?
I think it's a case-by-case basis. I think that if someone keeps making negative energy in the community, you see that the first time and you're aware of it. You have people keep a close eye on it, but you let them sort of figure themselves out. Maybe you send them a couple of messages in a public channel just saying like, hey, let's tone it back a bit. If they don't respond well to that, privately, I think it's about having a conversation. And if they're unable to respond to that in a constructive way, I think that kicking someone out of your DAO is perfectly okay. The most powerful thing about DAOs today, though, is you don't need to be in the community to actually capture the upside of that community. You can own tokens without being a part of the actual social club itself. And so that, reprimanding can actually be more on a social level of saying, hey, like, you need to check your energy here. Like, if you're not bringing in good, positive, constructive feedback, as you mentioned, it's okay to disagree, but I think it's different to disagree and then also alter, the conversation or alter the energy involved with that. So, there's been a couple situations we've had to have this happen. It's been a series of, very thoughtful conversation, and when it escalates to something more, it's hopping on a call and having a meaningful conversation about that. But most times, if you sit down with someone, you express that multiple people have expressed that you're not bringing, positive attitude here, they will fix their shit because they know that otherwise they're going to get kicked out and then they're going to ruin their social capital forever.
I also think this comes down to accountability, which is something that's really lacking in crypto in general. Like in crypto, we don't really have this like threat of violence, which like I don't want to bring into crypto, but there's, in the real world, we have rules and like social codes that we have to follow. Otherwise, we face consequences, and a lot of that doesn't exist in crypto. Like we're very siloed from those effects. So I think it really just comes down to accountability and how can we introduce interesting accountability systems without really infringing on anyone's rights per se.
I did posit the question. I don't have a deep answer per se, but I'm hearing a separate, like, accountability is, are you producing the work that you committed to and promised here? And I am finding that to be pretty challenging, even in our community, when there is no individual, like, I'm curious, Cooper, who is responsible then for asking a bad actor to leave the organization or the DAO?
I think you'll notice that every DAO has a key operator as their first hire full-time. Across all the DAOs you see, there's one person that's responsible for the day-to-day operations of that group. The point earlier about working groups, they're responsible for relaying communication between one another. They're also responsible for having those hard conversations. What I think is great about DAOs, though, is it's okay to have those hard conversations sooner. There's typically not a commitment to a salary or multi-year engagement here. It's like if I offer you a task and you suck at that task, it's okay to say you sucked at that task, and it's just not going to work. You can still hang out, but that's really what you're hiring for, and I think that's why we've seen that all DAOs, when they come to their first really formal hire, it's hiring that key operator to have those difficult discussions.
It's a lot about, like, I think, radical transparency. Like, that's a very good point. Like, I mean, accountability comes from people being willing to speak up and say what's working, what's not. And like, I think that's actually somewhat easier in like a lot of these internet native organizations where there's not as much like sort of restriction on how you can actually like coordinate. Like, I think that that's actually a benefit of DAOs, like not like a pro, not a con. The thing that I wanted to mention, which is just kind of like my answer to this question, is like I think we have a lot to learn from cooperatives, and I think we're somehow like missing a lot of the history of those organizations still. I would like definitely recommend that like folks that haven't looked at like Ostrom's work or like the Rochdale principles would like look into those, and like one of the sort of ideas behind that really does come down to like this sort of transparency in the system. So I just think that's super powerful. I guess like maybe like to tangent on that, like do people feel like cooperatives are a good framework for DAOs? Like a lot of people use this framing. Like how do you feel about cooperatives generally? Like does that resonate with you? There's a great post actually called The Prehistory of DAOs that talks about like, you know, whether guilds or cooperatives or otherwise are great representations of these things. Like I guess more broadly, what would the analogy beyond like internet native communities, which is also great, what analogies would you use to represent DAOs?
This might be dodging the question, but I really think it depends on the DAO. Like, there's such a wide spectrum of DAOs we see today, and I think that's kind of the point, is that you know, there's so many different structures that they can mold to that work for their specific organization. So for some DAOs, I think a co-op model makes a lot of sense, but in other DAOs, I do think that like hierarchy and more like top-down structures also make sense. Like I think we're sort of afraid of hierarchy in DAOs, and like yes, a big part of DAOs is like how can we create flatter organizations and decentralize power and control throughout that ecosystem, but you know, leadership is still important, and figuring out how to create effective hierarchies, I still also think is important for certain DAOs.
I think the mental model of cooperatives is very accurate, allowing everyone to have a say in what's going on, sharing transparently like any revenue that's coming in and sharing that with its member. I love those mental models, but I would double click on that. I think that hierarchy is actually very good if it's community elected. I think there's a difference from it being implemented at inception versus being voted in. And what you see now is that a lot of DAOs that scale to 100 plus members, they'll start a board where there'll be 7 to 10 highly competent community members who are elected by the rest of the group to make more actionable decisions. And that typically is a hierarchy structure where those 7 to 10 members have more authority and it means to enact power more quickly. But the fact that it was community elected and that can always be revised and rotated, I think that sets a nice precedent where you can have a co-op like ethos, but you can also have a more hierarchical structure that's able to make decisions more effectively.
I don't have a lot to add. I think we are missing a lot of history along the way from other places, and some of that is because I like to say that a lot of us came of age when crypto came of age. We were all becoming adults, as we still are, or at least as I feel I am every day. And I think that those histories are going to show up, and they'll come from experience from other people as different segments of the industries come in to the team. And I saw this at Coinbase. 50 people, we were all startups, right? We were all like tech kids figuring it out on the fly. And then boom, we got a whole bunch of people who had been at Google for decades, and like the information changed dramatically. The way that we operated changed dramatically. And I think that will happen to crypto as well. And the question is, how informed can we be in advance, and sort of how much can we have our own guiding light that's important to us? For Balancer, when we think about decentralization, it's data, wealth, and power every time, without fail. And those things, I think, if we set up now, will be more beneficial into the future.
I just want to add on to that really quick. I think you brought up a good point that DAOs right now feel very counterculture to me. You know, I think it's like a very badass, cool thing to be working for a DAO, but the biggest challenge for us over the next couple of years is going to be getting it to a point where it's very mature and scalable. And I think with that, you're going to lose a lot of the cool factor in favor of things that we've seen in the past. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what comes of that, but
then someone else will be cool.
I just know that we're wrapping up on time, so I just kind of want to pose to everyone like sort of the biggest gap you see in DAOs, and what tools, what area of the DAO ecosystem you're excited to see grow that will help evolve this entire space forward.
I'm really excited for pods. I don't know if you've heard of pods, but I think that'll be really good. No, I think that there's a lot to learn from, like, I mean, you know, to your point, I think there's a lot of actual And actually, speaking of Zach and the Coordinate folks, like they've talked a lot about like impact networks and those sorts of previous like non-crypto ideas. I do think there's a lot of learning there. I almost think there's like two paths of learning. There's the sort of like prehistory, like before DAOs, and then there's the DAO, sort of like the history itself. Like DAO historians may be a thing in the future. I think there could be a world in which we review what like worked well with like Metacartel or worked well with like Moloch DAO and like that early sort of era of these ecosystems. And I think that's going to be really important. I don't think we fully know what comes next because it's so early, but I'm excited to see it.
What was your question again? What was the final wrap-up question?
You got 10 seconds.
Stressful.
The question was, where do you want to see DAOs improve, basically?
Oh yeah, where's the gaps?
Yeah.
Did you answer as well, Cooper? Okay, go. You go.
My short answer is organizational structure and treasury management.
Yeah, I like that. I would go with like a place where people can feel like they are whole and belong, with very clear availability for conflict resolution, for discussions. Like I have grown more out of the work that I've done in crypto than in anywhere else. I feel like more of myself here and in this community than anywhere else I ever got to in the world. And I want other people to have that. And I don't know that we have any structures in place that put that and the challenge of that really in the forefront of the mind. So
I love that.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Beautiful. Do we all agree that the panel should be over? Should we vote?
I vote in favor of this proposal.
I
yeah.
vote yes.
I'm going to vote no.
Excellent.
You can stay. No, I'm kidding.
Thank you so much,
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you.